This message has no affiliation with the Department of War. All right, welcome back, everyone, and I am beyond humbled and blessed to be before you all today. I want to go over something that's very close to my heart, but often goes unrecognized because it's a minor issue. To me, it's not, and we're going to dive into that today. So if you've looked at a Zillow listing lately, or if you've walked through neighborhoods in places like Fort Myers or Ocean Springs, you have probably seen this issue firsthand. That for sale sign goes up, and 48 hours later, it's gone. It wasn't bought by a young couple looking for their first home. No, it was bought by an LLC you've probably never heard of for cash and potentially 5% over the asking price. Today, we are talking about the American home. We're looking at the giants like Blackstone and BlackRock and why, despite high interest rates that were supposed to cool the market, prices are still climbing. And we're asking the most important question for the next generation. Why can't a full-time, honest wage buy a roof over your head anymore? Why is that? So stick around and find out, because this is the Martin Memo. The Martin Memo. Now, before we move on, I do want to clarify some of the misinformation that I often see on social media. If you spend 5 minutes on social media, you will see people screaming about BlackRock buying up every house on the block. But here's the reality. People often use BlackRock and Blackstone interchangeably, but they are very different beasts with very different impacts on your neighborhood. If we go to BlackRock, think of BlackRock like the conductor of a massive global orchestra. They manage over $10 trillion. Their involvement in housing isn't usually direct ownership. They aren't the ones outbidding you for a 3-bedroom ranch. Instead, they are buying the mortgage-backed securities and the debt that fuels the market. They own massive stakes in the companies that build the houses and the banks that finance them, but they profit from the system. They're not your landlord. Blackstone, on the other hand, is the private equity giant that actually changed the game. After the 2008 crash, while families were losing their homes to foreclosure, Blackstone saw a once-in-a-generation opportunity. They founded a company called Innovation Homes. They didn't just buy a few homes. They spent over $10 billion to aggregate tens of thousands of single-family homes at cents on the dollar. Blackstone now controls approximately 62,000 single-family homes in the U.S. I know 62,000 sounds like a massive number, right? But it only represents 0.06% of the total single-family homes in the United States. So it's still a great number, but it's not nearly as big as they say it is. Now, on the contrary, this is where they have a much larger footprint. Blackstone owns over 230,000 apartment units in the U.S., making them the largest private equity owner of apartments in the country. They own roughly 10% of all private equity-owned apartments. That is huge. What Blackstone pioneered was vertical integration. They didn't just buy the house. They built a tech-driven engine to manage, renovate, and lease them at scale. They turned the starter home, the traditional entry point for the American middle class, into a permanent rental asset. Now, by 2026, even though Innovation Homes is now a separate public company, the blueprint they created has been copied by everyone, from American Homes for Rent to Progress Residential. They look for what they call strike zones, the neighborhoods that are near good schools and growing job markets, and they move faster than any human family can. They have all-cash offers, they waive inspections, and they close in days. Now, here's the kicker, though, on that note. On January 20th, we saw a massive shift. President Trump signed the Stopping Wall Street from Competing with Main Street Homebuyers executive order. I know, that's a lot. It directs federal agencies to stop facilitating these bulk sales and prioritize first-look programs for individual families. This is a great policy, by the way. But we have to be honest with ourselves. Is it too little too late? The damage is already baked into the market. While these firms own less than 4% of houses nationwide, they have concentrated power. In hot markets like Atlanta or Charlotte, institutional owners have controlled up to 25% of the single-family rentals. 25%. These numbers are outrageous. When one entity controls that much of a local market, they don't just follow the price, they set the price. They let it be known what the price is. They use algorithms like RealPage to coordinate rents, ensuring that even if houses stay vacant longer, the market rate never actually drops. They've turned your neighborhood into a line item on a spreadsheet in Manhattan. Now let's look at the numbers, because the numbers do not lie. They tell of a story of a dream that's being systematically priced out of our very reach. The shift in economic reality between the 1950s and 2026 is most visible in the affordability gap. In 1950, the median home price was roughly $7,300, while the median annual income was roughly $3,300. This meant a home cost just over 2 years' worth of salary, a ratio that allowed a single-income household to realistically achieve independence in their early 20s. By contrast, in 2026, the median home price has surged to approximately $416,000, while the median household income hovers at around $80,000. This creates a price-to-income ratio of over 5 to 1, more than double the burden of the 1950s. While a 1950s young adult could often pay for a year of university with a part-time summer job and move into a home shortly after, a 2026 young adult faces the triple threat of stagnant entry-level wages, skyrocketing education debt, and housing costs that have outpaced inflation by hundreds of %. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, that was 75 years ago, Zachary. Things have changed. Okay, fair point. But now let's look at the 80s. In 1984, the median house in the U.S. cost about $78,000. At the time, the federal minimum wage was $3.35 an hour. If you do the math, the home cost roughly 13 to 14 times a full-time minimum wage salary. It was a steep climb, but you could still see the summit yet ahead. Now, if we look at present-day America, the federal minimum wage has not budged from $7.25 in 17 years. Yes, I know states have adopted new policies and there's new laws and regulations, but for the sake of this argument, regardless, the federal minimum wage is $7.25. Meanwhile, the median home price has soared toward $416,000. That same house now costs over 28 times that annual salary. Think about that for a second. The barrier to entry hasn't just doubled, it has basically transformed from a difficult hurdle into a vertical wall. We were told that the minimum wage was never meant to be a living wage, but for decades, it was a stepping stone. You started there, you saved, and you moved up. But how do you save when the floor is made of quicksand? In 1984, the average rent was about 40% of a minimum wage check. Today, in 2026, the national average rent for a modest 2-bedroom is roughly $1,700. If you're a single earner at the federal minimum, your entire gross monthly income is only about $1,200. You are literally short $500 before you even buy a gallon of milk or pay a light bill. In major hubs like Raleigh or Charlotte, rent alone takes up 90% or more of a minimum wage earner's check. If you're spending every cent just to keep a roof over your head that you don't even own, how are you ever supposed to scrape together $20,000 or $50,000 for a down payment? You aren't. That is the bottom line. That is the point. The system is currently designed to keep you in a cycle of perpetual rentership. The ladder of social mobility hasn't just been pulled up. It has been set ablaze. It is on fire as we speak. We have what economists are calling a locked market. On one side, you have the golden handcuffs. There are millions of homeowners sitting on 3% mortgage rates that they locked back in 2020 and 2021. Even if they want to move, even if they need a bigger house for a growing family, they can't afford to sell. Why would you trade a $1,500 monthly payment for a $3,500 monthly payment on a similar house? The answer is you wouldn't. So they end up staying put, which this chokes the supply of existing homes. Now, on the contrary, on the other side, you have the new buyers. They are stepping into a market with 6.5% interest rates and record high prices, competing directly with Wall Street cash, which usually does not bode well for the consumer. When a private equity firm shows up with an all-cash offer and no contingencies, the person needs an FHA loan and a prayer does not stand a chance. We've moved from an ownership society to a subscription society. I'm good with my subscriptions for Netflix and Paramount, but I don't want it for a home. You subscribe to your music, your car, and now, well, Wall Street wants you to subscribe to your shelter. And just like any other subscription, they can raise the price whenever they want, and you are left with nowhere to go. Now let's get to the question that everyone is asking at their kitchen table. Why haven't prices dropped? We were told for 2 years at this point that the housing crash was coming. Rates went from 3% to over 7% in a blink. I just took an economics class my last semester, and basic economics say that when it costs more to borrow, demand drops. And when demand drops, prices follow. But here we are in 2026, and the median home price is still sitting near all-time highs. Why is that happening? The answer is two simple words: supply, scarcity. We are currently facing a structural housing deficit of nearly 4 million homes in this country. We simply stopped building for a decade after the 2008 crash, and we have never caught back up. Combine that with illegal immigration, and we are in a housing crisis. But it's not just that we aren't building enough, it is what we are building. If you look at the new construction permits for 2025 and 2026, they aren't for the 1,200 square foot starter homes like our parents bought. Builders are focusing on high-end luxury estates or massive build-to-rent communities. Why is that? Because the margins on a $250,000 house are razor thin, but the margins on a $700,000 luxury home or a corporate-owned rental complex are massive. Now, here is a piece of misinformation that the big firms love to spread. I have heard this so many times, and it is utterly ridiculous. They say that they only own a small percentage of the total market. Well, technically, they are not wrong, but institutional investors are net buyers. What does that mean? So when a family buys a home, they usually sell it 7 to 10 years later to move up. That home goes back into the resale pool for the next family. But when Blackstone or an LLC buys a home, they never sell it. They buy to hold for 30, 50, maybe even 100 years. They are effectively removing that property from the American dream forever and placing it into a corporate portfolio. So now every time a hedge fund outbids you, they aren't just taking a house, they are shrinking the future supply for everyone else. By 2026, we've seen inventory rise slightly, but affordability hasn't moved an inch because the quality of that inventory is either luxury or rental only. We are living in a market where scarcity isn't a bug, it is a feature that keeps corporate profits high. This is why Ben Shapiro's argument for relocating to lower cost areas is not a bad idea. His idea is grounded in the economic principle of rational self-interest and the reality of purchasing power. From this perspective, an individual's financial well-being is not just determined by their gross income, but by the real value of that income after accounting for local costs like housing, taxes, and utilities. In high-cost hubs like New York City or San Francisco, the blue splashes on the map, heavy government regulation and zoning laws have artificially inflated the floor for basic living, only making it mathematically impossible for early career workers to build equity. By moving to more affordable regions, such as parts of the Midwest, my old stomping grounds, or the South, also kind of my old stomping grounds. I don't know if Florida counts, but individuals can effectively give themselves a raise without changing their job. simply because the dollar buys significantly more square footage and life quality. Shapiro's stance frames moving as a form of voting with your feet, encouraging people to escape environments that are economically punitive and relocate to areas where the barrier to independence is lower and the path to property ownership is more attainable. So where does that leave us? Where does that leave us in the grand scheme of things? The solution to the crisis isn't just raising the minimum wage, like the liberals love to yell about. No, because if we raise wages without fixing the supply, the landlords will just raise the rent to match. It doesn't make sense. That's basic economics. And the solution isn't just lowering the interest rates, because that just triggers another bidding war with Wall Street cash. The solution is quite simple, my friends. We need to reclaim the soul of the American neighborhood. Some of my favorite core memories was growing up in a cul-de-sac where we used to have our annual block party. All of us would get together, we would have a cookout, we'd play some sports and share some laughs. That is the core. I don't want to be surrounded by properties that are rent controlled and have LLCs bidding at every single doorstep. That is not what I want. We have to decide as a country, is a home a shelter and a way for a family to build generational wealth? Or is it just another asset class for a hedge fund to squeeze for a 7% annual return? We are seeing the early stages of a renovate and reclaim movement. Communities in places like Chicago and Pittsburgh are starting to use land banks and first look programs to ensure that vacant lots and foreclosures go to local families first, not distant shareholders. But we have to move faster. If we don't fix the supply and stop the corporate buyout of our streets, we are heading toward a rentership society, a society where you own nothing. You subscribe to your shelter, and the bank or a firm in a glass tower controls your stability and way of life. That is not the American way. That is not what the founders dreamed on. Keep your eyes on the data, keep your feet on the ground, and don't let anyone tell you that wanting a piece of the American dream is misinformation or far out of reach. It is your right, and it is worth fighting for. With that being said, it is time to move on to my favorite segment of the week, and that is the cold monologue, where you ask us questions throughout the week, we write them down on pieces of paper, and then you get my pure, authentic reaction. So let's see what question we have in store for today. What do you think of the Alex Pretti shooting? Well, first of all, I have to say this is very sad. It really is. And I've said this numerous times. I will say it again. I do not blame the Alex Pretti or the Renee Good of the society. I blame the elected officials over them. The people that instoke violence with their words and say, take to the streets or call ICE agents modern day Gestapo. Words have consequences, and we have unfortunately seen it again. As far as the shooting, I will say that I think that that was a little tyrannical by our ICE agents. I love ICE. I will support ICE. But that specific instance, just that one, even Renee Good is justified. But that specific instance right there was not a good look for federal law enforcement and not a good look for ICE. And that is something that will need to get addressed. I hope they do a full-scale investigation and address and hold the people accountable. One thing I will say, if you are going out to a protest, I'm all in favor. Go out, protest all you want, but stop interfering. You are interfering from ICE agents doing their jobs, going and getting that child predator down the street, going and getting that murderer right next to you. Stop interfering with ICE actions. You can be upset all you want, but stop. I also think it's funny that 20% of the deportations happen in Texas, and yet there's no outrage there. But the 2.2% that happen in Minnesota, it's like it's a George Floyd all over again. Protest, and it's extraordinary. It's very sad to see. But again, I don't blame the Alex Pretti. I don't blame the Renee Good. I blame the elected officials over top with Jacob Fry and Tim Walz and so many others. So it's very unfortunate that that did happen. But again, our elected officials need to be held accountable for the words that they say, because words do have consequences. As promised, I did want to go over the March for Life that happened last week. let me tell you, that was an experience that I will never forget. It was so humbling, and it was amazing getting out there, conducting probably close to 25 interviews and interacting with like-minded individuals. One note that I will say, it was so hopeful. There was so much hope in the air. And as much as the liberal media wants to paint it as a old white man issue, I would say 75% of the individuals out there were probably from the Generation Z, Generation Alpha. This was huge, and it was amazing, and there were probably close to 20,000 individuals out there supporting babies and protecting the unborn. There's a couple interviews that stood out, but the one I want to talk about today, I interviewed a couple college guys out there, and I pointed over to the protesters that were forming, the 25 of them, and I said, what would you tell them? What would you say to those individuals? And you know what they said? They didn't say what the left likes to demonize us, and they didn't use any of those terrible words that the left use. They said, I would pray for them. I would talk to them. I would have a civilized conversation. I would spread the gospel with them. They were so joyful. They put life into the air. They didn't take away. They didn't call them any names. They said, I would pray for them and I would talk to them civilized. And I believe that wholeheartedly. And I want to see more of that return to our politics. Well, with that being said, that is all we have in store for today. Be sure to join us on Monday as we have another live stream. I'm welcoming on Isaiah Lafone to the show, so you do not want to miss that. Isaiah is a great colleague of mine, a great buddy, and I cannot wait to have a live stream with him coming up. So with that being said, be sure to share your thoughts on X, follow us on Instagram and Facebook at The Martin Memo, and do not forget to subscribe to us on YouTube. Now, in case I don't see you, good morning, good afternoon, and good night. This is The Martin Memo. God bless. The Martin Memo.